All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Kevin Stewart. I'm the executive director of the Austin Institute. We are supporting, the Austin Institute is supporting this event. It's an event of the James Q. Wilson Forum. The Wilson Forum is a student organization where students get to decide what speakers are brought in, and the Austin Institute contributes the money to pay the bills. So if you'd like to help do that, I will have a sign-up sheet going around. We like to know who came, and we like to be able to keep in contact with people. So we've got a line for your name, your email address, and then it says JQW ? If you would like more information about the James Q. Wilson Forum and the opportunity to help pick next year's speakers, just give us a check mark there, and we'll get in touch. There are really no other requirements, so it's not a student organization that's going to take up a lot of your time. The Austin Institute is a social science research institute. We ask questions fearlessly, we do research rigorously, and we try to host good debates, good discussions, bringing in people from lots of viewpoints, and often viewpoints that are not heard or are only heard softly within the rest of the academy. And so I think today's presentation from Chris will be a good example of that.
I'm loud.
Yeah. The next and final speaker of this semester will be Dr. Matthew Wright on Thursday, April 21st at 3:30 p.m. in BATS 5.108. And his topic is family versus freedom, pulled in different directions. So that promises to be an interesting lecture. Today, our speaker is Dr. Chris Surprenant, Associate Professor at the University of New Orleans. He got his BA from Colby College and his PhD from Boston University. He is the director of the Alexis de Tocqueville Project on Law, Liberty, and Morality. He's a specialist in the history of philosophy, especially ancient, early modern, and Immanuel Kant. Also moral philosophy and political philosophy. He is the author of 4 books, 2 in print already and 2 forthcoming: Kant and the Cultivation of Virtue, Kant and Education, Kant and the Scottish Enlightenment, and Against Incarceration. In 2012, Chris was recognized by the Princeton Review as one of the top 300 professors in the United States. Welcome, Dr. Surprenant.
Thank you, Kevin, for having me. I appreciate it. A little feedback on the mic. So we've got a small group today, and so what I'd like to do is keep this as informal and discussion-based as possible, because I think this topic of the role of free exchange and individual well-being, and then the secondary question of the role of the state in when we might think the state or someone else should come in and limit free exchange, I think is a particularly interesting and timely question, especially given the situation of American politics right now. That you have, a significant number of people that seem to be supporting, as best as I can tell, a fascist candidate, and then you have another significant number of people who seem to support a self-declared socialist, and then a lot of other people that, don't really know what they want to do because the options seem to be so bad. But this idea of the role of free exchange in society and how free exchange can contribute to well-being, I think is central to this issue of not just political leadership, but what we also should be doing in the country and what's the best way to proceed in terms of public policy, but also, especially for someone who's interested in, say, philosophy, with pretty good theoretical underpinnings. So one of the things that I notice when I teach intro to, too much there. There we go. One of the things that I notice when I teach an intro to philosophy class or a PPE class, so a class that looks at the intersection of philosophy, politics, and economics, is that a lot of our students in the liberal arts haven't had any courses in economics. And I don't just mean courses, that there's minimal sort of background economic knowledge. So one of the fun things about hanging out with economists is that they have all these fun games in their classes to teach people economic concepts. And one of them is the trading game. And so I play this game with my students in my intro class to try to show them the value of free exchange. This is the trading game, or what fun-sized Kit Kats can teach us about human well-being. So how the primary iteration of the trading game works is that at the beginning of class, I'll go around and I'll have 3 candies in a bag, or a bag full of those, the fun-sized candies, right, where you have the Mr. Good bars and the Hershey's and Kit Kats and whatever else. They pick 3 out of the bag. right? And then I ask them how happy they are with what they've been given. And they have to write it on a scale of 1 to 10. And then I ask them, well, what is the way that we can make your well-being improve? How can you become happier with what you have or what you've selected? Right? And the obvious answer then is what? Participation part.
More Kit Kats.
Yeah, that's one way. So the state can come in and give you more of what you want. But if I've exhausted all of my resources, right? So let's say that I've emptied the bag. How can we allow people to, without increasing the pool of resources or without adding more resources into the system, what is the only way, in theory, that you can get people to improve their well-being or their happiness with what they have? Sorry? So you can allow them to save it, right? Or if they eat it, you can allow them to eat it. But so Anthony, let's say, has 3 Kit Kats, and he doesn't like Kit Kats. And Kevin has a Mr. Goodbar and a regular Hershey's and something else. And Kevin would prefer if he would have drawn a Kit Kat, and Anthony would have preferred to draw a Mr. Goodbar. How can we resolve this problem?
We trade.
They trade, right? So one of the things that I allow them to do is have them write down how happy they were with their selection. And then we say, okay, now you can trade. And there are no rules to trading. They can trade however they want. So if Anthony wants to give 2 Kit Kats for 1 Mr. Goodbar, they can do that, right? Or they can make whatever other sorts of arrangements they want. And one of the nice things that you see after the trading is that everyone's well-being has improved. Right? There are some exceptions, right? If someone draws something that no one wants. So this is how I learned that undergraduate students do not like sugar-free grape gum. Right? Someone drew the 3 packs of sugar-free grape gum, and she was stuck. Right? She was stuck with these things. So there are some other iterations of the trading game that we play, because one of the challenges or problems of this game is that, well, think about it. What are some of the challenges or potential problems with this game? If we're trying to find a way to have this game mimic society or mimic what we see around us, what are some of the problems? Yeah, Anthony.
It's that there's only one type of good. So there's you have the category of candy. What happens to the people who don't want any of the candy?
That's right. So that's one problem. What are some other problems? So someone might say, look, I'm not able to eat sugar. I don't like candy. I don't like any of this. This is garbage. So that would lead them to not want to participate. Right? And obviously, if they're operating in society, they have more options than just candy. Some other problems with the trading game, if we're trying to see how the game mimics society? Yeah. Sorry, what's your name?
Nick.
Nick.
It appears to be zero sum.
In what way?
There's a fixed amount of wealth or goods. There's a fixed amount of candy,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't increase or decrease. It only gets reallocated.
Well, it can decrease.
Oh, yeah, actually, it doesn't increase.
It doesn't increase. So he's right that there's no more new candy getting added to the system, at least in this version of the trading game. It can decrease when someone eats it, right? What we do see, though, in terms of fixed sums is that we know that, say, well-being or happiness isn't fixed, right? So happiness can keep going up based on the exchange. Other things that you see wrong with the game, there's one thing when maybe you guys are more free market oriented than my usual groups, because there's one thing that folks shoot their hands up and say, this is an obvious flaw in this game, at how I described it.
Everyone's on an equal footing.
Everyone's got something. So we play some other iterations of the game, right? So in that one that I mentioned, that everyone's got 3 pieces of candy, right? There are some iterations of the game where we say give someone 5 and give people 1. There's one where I don't give someone any, and you write a note, so they all receive instructions when it comes out. I wrote a note saying, your job or your goal is to acquire candy however you want. And then I bold and underline, however you want. And I say, don't come and ask me. You can do whatever you want. One of my friends at Georgetown played this game, and I guess one of the kids, it was like her friend's roommate or something, and tried to blackmail the student into giving candy. So that might not be the best, but this is what happens. People operate that way. Another iteration thinks about restricting trade. So what we say is, maybe only male students can trade with other male students. Or my favorite one is that I can start imposing taxes. So every time someone trades, I take one of the candies. So the 2 trading partners will have to decide how to get me that piece of candy. How do you think those types of restrictions change up the game? that if every time someone traded, so if you wanted to trade a Mr. Goodbar for a Kit Kat, I'm going to get one candy. You guys have to figure it out. What's going to be the result?
Me end up trading more items, so that on a net basis you have what you want.
So you might make larger trades. Would you make more trades or fewer trades? Fewer, because the more times you trade, the more I get. So the last iteration, before we move on, so this is some of the problems, right? So problems that you guys just mentioned. But the last iteration involves me taking the tax revenue in candy and then distributing it back to the person with the least, right? And the students seem to think that that's fair, except you can play this game and you give a student instruction and say, look, eat the candy as the game's going along. Make sure that you have none at the end. So I collect all of this tax revenue, right? The person's eating the candy, and at the end I distribute it back to that person who has eaten all the candy during the course of the game. You can imagine people's responses to that. They don't really like that. But this is useful. At least the trading game is useful because it allows us to understand that for the most part, everyone's well-being is improved via exchange. That when you allow people to trade freely or you allow people to exchange goods and there's no coercion, even if people end up with an unequal amount of stuff, both of those people's situation is better off. So if Anthony were to trade 2 Kit Kats for Kevin's Mr. Goodbar, even though Anthony's down to 2 candies and Kevin's up at 4 candies, Anthony's going to say that his well-being, or he's better off with 2 candies than he was with 3, and Kevin's going to say that he was better off when he has 4 candies instead of 2, or whatever the numbers were. I seem to lose track of them. So this is what we learn via the trading game. This is useful for students without backgrounds in economics to understand how free exchange works. So the question then is, if it's the case that generally people are better off when they participate in free exchange, under what conditions or why would we ever limit free exchange? Why would we ever say that these 2 trades or this exchange between 2 free and equal people, we as either the state or the society should limit it? And so it's cheating, it's giving you everything. So one of the things we can think about is, well, why do we limit it? There's one class of things that we might say that something shouldn't be bought or sold. Can you give me examples? Again, small group. Humans, right? Okay, so human beings maybe shouldn't be bought or sold. So let's separate out, say, human beings, because let's imagine that humans are participating in the exchange. So non-human entities, other things that shouldn't be bought or sold, or classes of things? Organs. Okay, so that there seems to be a class of things that, well, tell me, why do you think organs shouldn't be bought or sold?
I think they should, but the argument is that they shouldn't be bought and sold. I can't even think of a good argument. Really, that I guess it'll only go to rich people. Poor people won't be able to get organs.
Okay, so there might be some, let me tweak that a bit, right? So there might be something about the buying and selling of organs or the buying and selling of body parts that somehow trivializes human life or trivializes the dignity of persons, that there's something involved in that exchange that is morally corrupting. So people may make a similar argument when it comes to, say, the buying and selling of sex, that here is something that if exchanged for no money is okay when it's consensual, but if it is exchanged when there's some sort of cash transfer involved as well, there's something corrupting about that act of exchange. So there's that class of things, that the buying and selling of certain goods corrupts those things. Do you think that there are things that people shouldn't be allowed to buy or sell or even possess generally? Because that would work here too, right? If I don't think I should be able to possess, say, something like this, then the buying and selling of it would also be something that we would want to restrict.
So
nuclear weapons, right? Or dangerous materials, drugs. So back in the day, right, the test to see if you were a true libertarian was whether or not you were in favor of marijuana legalization. And now that's not good enough, right? It's, do you believe that nuclear weapons should be bought and sold? So if I'm around a group of sort of, hardcore libertarians, they asked, do you believe that nuclear weapons? And I was like, no, that's crazy. Well, you're not a real libertarian. Well, I guess not. But so there are two things, right? So some things that shouldn't be possessed at all, and then there are other things that buying and selling corrupts. Now, when it comes to, say, things that shouldn't be possessed at all, let's set that to the side. In terms of buying and selling, how it corrupts other things, Jason Brennan and Peter Jaworski just published a book on this topic called Markets Without Limits. Their thesis in that book is that anything that is done for free, that is moral to do for free, it's also okay to do it for profit. That there's nothing inherently corrupting about associating cash or money into a transaction, because anything we see as corrupting in that way really is just a cultural influence. That you can find cultures around the world, and they give really brilliant examples in this book of cultures that even inside of marriage, when a husband has sex with his wife, that one of the things the husband is supposed to do is to provide the wife a gift, cash, so that she can go and buy things. So they've got great examples of cultural practices around the world where we might say, that's corrupting, that's wrong. That's the thesis in that book. I'm going to just set that to the side because other people have focused on that. What I want to focus on is this, externalities. So when I exchange something with someone else, that person has consented to that part of the exchange. So if I exchange a Mr. Goodbar with Kevin, and Kevin gives me a Kit Kat, and I start eating the Kit Kat and he hears it, right? That's something that he in some way has consented to. Right? He's part of that exchange. He's foreseen all of the negative consequences. You have an economics background, I think. You know what an externality is? What's an externality?
It's when the costs are not borne by the person who receives the benefits. All of the costs are not borne by the person who receives them.
Yes. Well, that's half of it. I mean, usually we think about it in terms of cost. So the response was that when we have an exchange, an externality is either a harm or a benefit that's incurred by a third party who did not consent to receive that harm or benefit. Usually we're not worried about benefits. So if someone gives me a benefit that I didn't ask for, I'm usually okay with it. But if someone harms me in a way that I didn't ask for, then I'm usually not okay with it. So that's an externality, so cost or benefit incurred by a party. And we can think about this in usual exchanges, right? So for instance, actually you give me an example. Again, we've got a small group. Can you think of an obvious example of an externality where you are harmed by free exchange or free transactions between other individuals?
Pollution.
Yeah, pollution. So I go to the gas station and I freely involve myself in a purchase of gasoline. The use of that gasoline, the burning of that gasoline causes, to some extent, depending on how I do it, harms to other people. Those are externalities. So your harm, or smoking cigarettes is a really easy example. So I'm around someone who's smoking a cigarette. They engaged in a free transaction with the cigarette company, but now I am experiencing, as a third party, this harm that I didn't consent to experience. So one of the things that I want to argue is that the times when we should look to limit free exchange are the times when we're looking at externalities. But there are a lot of externalities that seem to be illegitimate as opposed to, say, legitimate externalities. And let me suggest this is one way. Let me give you some examples at least. So we have pollution. And there seem to be obvious harms associated with, say, being around someone who's smoking cigarettes, or if a company was, say, dumping batteries in the stream that I was getting my water from, right? That's a type of externality that we may say is obviously harmful. But there are other externalities that people may say are not obviously harmful. So let me use, I'm trying to think of another example on the fly because I don't like this example for right now, but I'm going to use it anyway. So the United States, we legalize same-sex marriage, or we allow people of same-sex couples to engage in relationships. If I see a same-sex couple walking down the street and holding hands and doing whatever, and that display of affection makes me feel yucky, for lack of a better word, that feeling yucky is an externality. That is a harm. It's a real harm, right? I'm experiencing it, caused by the behavior of other people and the free actions of other people. So the problem ends up being, how do we separate out the externalities that are like that, where someone feels yucky, right, from the externalities where we may say there's a real harm? Because I think the vast majority, and then you can change the example. If you don't like that particular example, pick another one. But there seem to be obvious cases where someone experiences something, does suffer what they believe is a legitimate harm, but it's not something where we want to say, look, the state should step in or someone else should step in. Where in the case of, say, cigarette smoke or batteries or whatever else, we may want to identify those harms as real, for lack of a better word, and we think that other people should step in. So the question then is, how do we decide? How do we draw that distinction? You see, right? So there seem to be three ways of doing it. In terms of, so does everyone understand where the problem right now? The problem is, how do I separate out the real, what I'm going to call the real externalities, where people are suffering legitimate harms, from what we might say are illegitimate, at least from the standpoint of interference from, say, like a state entity? How do we draw the line between those two? Because we have to if we're going to set up laws. So the first way of doing it, well, what do you think? If we live in this room, how could we decide between those two sets of harms? What would be one way of doing it? Yeah. Sorry, what was that? Voting. So there's my democratic solution. We vote. So we could all draw straws, not draw straws, that's not voting. We could cast ballots, right? We could say, do you think that the harm caused to someone who feels yucky when they see a same-sex couple having a relationship or communicating with each other, is that a real harm? And we could vote on that. What's perhaps some of the problems with leaving it up to democracy to separate out, Anthony's already laughing, leaving it up to democracy to separate out the real harms from the not so real harms? So minority rights are trampled, right? There's no clear standard for how we do the evaluation. It seems to present a problem. So another way of doing it is the conservative view. Conservative with little c, not political Republican conservative. So one of the things we could do is look to culture and tradition to make this decision. Because we know that if society is just historically, that if you make too quick of a jump in terms of changing policies, it causes problems and disruption to society. Let me suggest, someone like Robert George is going to argue for a position like this. We don't have the time to go into right now. We can talk about it later if you want, but I'm not sure this is the position that gets you the best results, but I just have to leave it at that. The other option is the liberal position, and this is, again, small L liberal. So one of the ways we could do it in terms of avoiding or trying to figure out or separate out those externalities, the legitimate externalities or the ones with legitimate harms from the illegitimate harms, is to follow this principle of trying to maximize the freedom of everyone. And so what we would look at is say, if there's a situation where what you've done in your free exchange somehow has limited my freedom to act, then that is what we might describe as a legitimate harm. And so this position, if you take this position here, this liberal view, the underlying assumption is an empirical claim. And that's the claim that if you maximize individual freedom, you're maximizing human well-being. Because if you don't believe that maximizing individual freedom maximizes human well-being, then you're probably at this conservative view, where what we want is order, and what we want is some sort of social stability. So again, empirical claim, and obviously this is a claim that holds generally. There are a lot of cases that we can mention where maximizing someone's freedom doesn't maximize his or her well-being, right? So children, people who are mentally handicapped, people who are intoxicated or are otherwise not of their faculties. But otherwise, my sense is that if we polled this room, if I was looking to maximize your well-being, do you think you would be better off if you were given more freedom and the ability to choose, or less? Yeah, I would imagine everyone here says more. That could be a cultural thing as well, because we're a society that greatly values individual freedom. But I think this is a reasonably good claim, at least to assume for our purposes right now. So the question again, if we're trying to differentiate between legitimate harms and illegitimate harms for the purpose of externalities and to figure out when we might want to interfere, and if we're also looking to try to maximize individual freedom, which is the liberal view, John Stuart Mill provides us with a solution as to how we can separate out legitimate externalities from illegitimate ones, and he says that what we don't want is to have interference, say from the state, when we're looking at what he calls contingent harms. So if a harm is contingent, you guys know what does contingent mean? So you're my philosophy student, so I'll.
It's, I guess, dependent on something that can be easily changed.
Yeah, or relative to the person. Right, so if we're looking at a contingent harm, so again, if I feel yucky when I see two men walking down the street holding hands, that's a contingent harm because, say, Anthony may not feel yucky. Right, it's relative or peculiar to me. That's the type of harm that the state or no one else should interfere with. So if I engage, what was your name? I'm sorry, I didn't. Blake. So if I engage in a free transaction with Blake, and Anthony has some sort of contingent or experiences some sort of contingent harm as a result, like he's jealous, for instance, that's not something where we should interfere. And at least this is the position that we get from John Stuart Mill, and I think it's reasonably good, at least for our purposes right now. So let me quickly go through the who should address them. So how do we decide? Sorry, that's the same slide. So who should address the externalities? Let me skip over that quickly. The obvious answer that I think people give is the state, right? That the state should come in and be the one that regulate out the externalities or decide when someone is experiencing something that's either contingent or non-contingent. Let me also suggest that there is private governance that might be useful as well. Are you guys familiar? How much private governance? What is private governance? Blake, anyone? Private governance. If I said that this is, so public governance would be what? How does a state differ from, say, I don't know, the board of governors at my country club? Right, so I'm a member of a country club. I enjoy playing golf. One of the reasons to be a member of a country club is that then you can play golf whenever you want. But the country club sets a lot of rules for regulation of the course and various other things that are connected to membership. Some of the rules I think are good, right? So we're not allowed to use the course on Mondays. That is the day when they do maintenance on the course. Some of the rules I think are kind of silly. So they don't allow you to wear cargo pants on the courts. No pants with expanding pockets, right? So I find that rule to be silly. And there are some rules that I find to be offensive. So women cannot be members of my club. What's my remedy?
Exit.
I can exit, right? So my remedy to the country club, if I don't like something that they're doing, is that I can do some sort of cost-benefit analysis, and I can say, you know what, this is too offensive, I'm being harmed by this, I can leave. And as soon as I leave, I'm no longer affected by the behavior of the club. But you could imagine something else that the club does. So imagine that we had a problem with geese, right? Because they poop all over the course. And so what my club did was they inserted a bunch of strobe lights and loud music during the week, and they got rid of the geese. The problem there is that if you were living around the club, you might not be able to sleep at night because of the strobe lights and the loud music. This would present a problem. But what is the recourse available to someone outside of the club? So that person's being affected by club policies. The club is operating on their own property, but that third party is being affected. What can they do? Assume no state or no set of justices or whatever appeal beyond the club. Right? In the case if it's just internal club policies, I can fix that. Right? I can leave, but that person can't leave. So there seem to be limits of private governance. The reason why I mention this is that frequently I give this to sort of free market libertarian groups, this talk. And they're, raw private governance, right? That private governance is, right, we don't need the state. But there seem to be obvious situations where there are limits to private governance. So for my purposes, let's just assume that the state or some sort of entity is the appropriate way of dealing with those non-contingent harm externalities. So we've got the set of non-contingent harm externalities, and we identify those to go back to Mill, right? That again, non-contingent harms. And now we need an entity that somehow deals with that. And let's just say, for our purposes here, it's the state. Then the issue is how. So what's the problem we've identified? So we've got these non-contingent harm externalities. Someone's got to address them. That's going to be the who. Leave that to the state. The question is how now. And the challenge here is that as we've gone through, we've got three things that we're trying to maximize, or three things that we at least for the purposes of the discussion, I think I've shown are reasonable to assume. The first is that maximizing individual freedom maximizes well-being, generally. The second is that free exchange leads to non-contingent harm externalities. This is just a recap of what we've done so far. And the third is that the state ought to mitigate these non-contingent harm externalities when private governance fails. So allow people to resolve their own disputes first. So if I'm, say, eating a Kit Kat, and I'm eating it very loudly, and Anthony is upset by this harm, that we should try to work this out first before you get the state involved. Seems reasonable. So we've got these 3 points that we're trying to follow. The question then is, how do we do it in a way that gets us one? So it seems like what we want, right? So how should the state behave? It seems like what we want is as minimal state involvement as possible. So Mike Munger gives a solution to this. And Mike Munger says that what the state ought to do in these cases is the right kind of nothing. Do you guys know Mike? Yeah. He used to teach here. Yeah. Yeah. So he's now at Duke. Mike's great. Any of you guys know Mike Munger? You know Mike. Anyone else know Mike Munger? So Mike's a character. I'm going short on time, so I won't tell stories about Mike, but I will tell you the story that he tells, which is, I think this is after he moved from here. He wasn't here anymore, but because he was at Duke when this happened. He was in Germany teaching a class over the summer, and he went to the grocery store in Germany, and he saw this old lady pushing a grocery cart to their car. And so Mike, being a friendly and reasonably helpful guy, goes over to the woman who he doesn't speak any German, she doesn't speak any English, and he kind of gestures to her that he's going to help her, at least what he thinks, bring the cart back to the bin. And she starts screaming at him in German, right? Apparently what he didn't know is that in Germany, in order to get your cart out, you have to deposit €1. And it locks the cart. It's like the thing in the airport. You deposit the dollar in the cart, it releases it, and when you return the cart, in Germany, you get your euro back to prevent people from leaving the carts in the parking lot. So this lady thought that Mike was trying to steal her euro, right? And so she's screaming at him in German. A German police officer comes up, and I don't know if you've ever been to Germany, German police officers don't really have a sense of humor. So the German police officer comes up, and you have this lady screaming in German, and you have Mike Munger is not a small guy, right? So you have this big guy, and so the German policeman demands to see Mike's information. He's sort of fumbling around in his wallet. The German police officer sees his Duke ID. Turns out that the police officer's kid went to Duke, and immediately, from Munger's perspective, the conversation changes. Right? The police officer has some familiarity with Mike. Mike explains the situation to the police officer. The police officer kind of laughs, and he says, I don't think this lady understands English. Here's how we're going to resolve this. I'm going to yell at you in English. You're going to look sheepish to the woman and look like I've actually done something to reprimand you, and then you're going to just carry about your business. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a lovely time. And he goes, I think we're done right here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, right? And the old lady's sitting there going, and Mike's going, looking nervous and gives the lady back her cart. So Mike uses the story to say that this is how the state should act. It's the right kind of nothing. That what the German police officer did in this particular case is he was able to resolve this problem without actually doing anything. And so if you're interested, Munger has an article on this. It's titled The Right Kind of Nothing. But I think Mike's wrong here, because I don't think in this particular case that German police officer did nothing. In fact, the German police officer thoughtfully assessed the situation and figured out the least amount that he needed to do in order to resolve this problem. So instead of Munger's position, how the state should address these externalities, I'm going to give you Surprenant's position, which is that the state should act like a referee in a game. So have all of you guys played soccer, softball, baseball, football? What do we know about referees? When is a referee a good referee? When you don't see them. That doesn't mean they don't call fouls. That doesn't mean they don't get involved in the game. It means that what?
It means they don't determine the outcome.
That they don't determine the outcome. That the rules are already set, everyone knows how the rules should be implemented, and this is just the person whose task it is to carry those things out. You don't see them. In the case of the German police officer now, you may want to say, well, you did see him, but that guy did the least amount possible in order to resolve this situation. And I think that if we looked at the state in this way, if I go back, that if we're after these three things, thinking about the state as a referee in the game is probably the best way to get you those three things. So think about this from the standpoint of actual public policy. What would this look like? Because it's easy for me to say right now, well, look, the state should act like a referee in a game, and you might say, well, what does that actually look like? What does that mean when it comes to public policy? So let's think through what I think is perhaps one of the biggest issues addressing or in the US right now of relevance, which is public welfare programs or social welfare programs. Everyone has very strong views on how, to what extent, all of the various questions related to social welfare programs. But if I asked you this, how many of you agree with that statement? Individuals who are worse off due to no fault of their own should be provided with assistance. Not asking how much, I'm not asking. Almost everyone in the US would agree with this statement. What we disagree on is how it gets carried out. Now, some people, if you're interested in someone who thinks that this statement is false, you can read stuff by Walter Block at Loyola University. So he doesn't think that the government should provide people with anything. But I think that we live in a democracy, and most people are going to agree with that, at least in this country. So if this is what we're after, right? If we all believe this, and then we're back to this, right? How do we apply those 1, 2, and 3 to allow us to realize this statement that we all think should be provided for? So this is the current amount that we spend in the US right now on social welfare programs. $515 billion. I think that all of us, when you start hearing large numbers, we just don't really understand how much money this actually is. Like this does not cover education. This covers things like food assistance, medical assistance, housing. This is the money that goes to people who are living below the poverty line. So not public education, okay? Right now we have 40 million citizens who are at or below the poverty line. And that's roughly $12,000 per person per year. Some of you know that the poverty line changes if you've got, say, a family, but roughly we're looking at $12,000 per person per year. This does actually not require complex math. This is very simple math. What I'm going to do is we're going to divide 515 billion, I think some of you know what's coming, by 440 million. It's $480 billion. So if we took the 40 million people in this country who are living at or below the poverty line, who are receiving government assistance, we could literally give them all a check for $12,000. Literally, every single one of them, we could hand them a check, and it would be cheaper than the amount we are spending on social welfare programs right now. If you define poverty by living below this, we could literally eliminate poverty in this country simply by handing them a check, and it would be cheaper. And this assumes that all those people have zero. Many of them have incomes. They have incomes of $6,000, $8,000, $10,000, whatever else. So if the issue is about actually resolving problems, And if what we're trying to do is maximize freedom and look at the role that the government could play, one of the things that you could argue for, is a guaranteed basic income. That would be the equivalent of this government acting like the referee. Because as a society or as a state, we've decided that what's important is this. So we have set the rules. Say this is one of the rules. We don't think that anyone in this country should be provided with that assistance. And then the question for the state, the practical question is, well, how do we achieve that? How do we achieve that in the way to allow people to actually get out of their bad situation, but also in the way of doing it most efficiently? So let me close by trying to anticipate one objection to this. So when I give this talk and when I talk more about guaranteed basic income, the most frequent objection that I hear is that, well, how can you just give poor people money? Don't you know they're going to blow it on plasma TVs and liquor and cigarettes? And I say, wow, that's offensive. I think one of the things that we see in this country is that it's very difficult for individuals, obviously, to live when they're living below a certain level. But everyone, it seems to me, and based on our poll and just talking with people, I mean, if you ask people who is in the best position to know what is best for themselves, in terms of what it means for them to live well and how they can be most successful, they will tell you that it is them. And so if you follow this approach, right, if you go for a basic income as a way of, as the state acting as a referee in a game, and remember, we're sort of off the topic of well-being and free exchange, but this was my practical policy solution. People will certainly make bad decisions. So if we increase freedom, going back to that issue of well-being and free exchange, people will make bad decisions. Someone will trade 2 Kit Kats for a Mr. Goodbar and decide that they really don't like Mr. Goodbars. But they have to be free to make that decision. And my suggestion is, when you look at the data, that when you allow people to be more free and you allow them to exchange more things, they're going to make better decisions more frequently than they're making now. So my argument goes back to what I said towards the beginning, that if what we want to do, or if you buy that there's an association between well-being and free exchange, then the question becomes, what does the state look like? What does the state's involvement look like? And my suggestion then is what we want the state to be as minimally involved as possible. And I think that you can actually get that with a bunch of different public policy proposals. This is just one of them. So that's all I got. I'd love to talk, though, further about this and to see what questions or comments you have. So we can talk about policy implications, or we can go back and talk about theory. But one of the reasons why I added this particular bit at the end was because I would finish before and someone would say, well, what does this look like in terms of public policy? What does it actually mean to say that the state should act like a referee in the game? And for me, that's, in terms of social welfare programs, just handing people a check, because they're not playing. And right now we have the state, or we have people picking winners and losers. So when you have the auto industry being bailed out, or when you have the state giving subsidies, say corporate welfare, to different companies, right? They're picking winners and losers. In the same way, it's like when the ref doesn't call a foul on LeBron, but Chris Paul gets the foul, right? You have people picking winners or losers, and that doesn't seem like the role the state should play if it's operating properly.
I've got a microphone for questions. Again, this is because Q&A is totally useless for people watching online if they can't hear the question that you ask. So if you'll just raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you when you have a question. Questions?
Anthony. He promised me that there would be no tough questions, so we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I think this will be up your alley. So it seems that from the beginning of your talk, you're talking about, there's this whole notion about well-being, and I think one of the reasons that people have a problem with free exchanges is that they may have their own assessments of what someone's well-being should look like and what should make them happy. In other words, it's kind of following the gaming reference, right? It's not just that the referee's enforcing the rules, but the referee is making judgments on which strategy should win and what kind of strategy should you use. So I was curious what you would think about that concept, right? Which is one of the reasons that people want to interfere is because they get that yucky feeling of someone's exchange that makes them happier, and that doesn't fall in line with their sense of feeling.
So I think it's right. I think all of us feel that way. So the reason why all of us make the decisions that we make in our lives is because we think that those are the best decisions for us in that particular situation. And if we didn't think that was the best decision for us, we would do something else. With that said, I find it offensive, and that's a very strong word. Everyone always gets offended in academia. But I think it's offensive when we say that, look, I know better than someone else. And usually those someone else's are poor and uneducated. In practice, that's what it ends up being, right? So no one comes into the room full of, say, PhDs who are, well, I know better than you guys, we're going to take away. Actually, sometimes they do that. I was thinking that they just passed a smoking ban on our campus, which is essentially that I know as the state, right, the state of Louisiana knows better than people at the University of New Orleans or in the Louisiana State University, that we don't want you smoking, and therefore we're going to pass this. You know, it strikes me as not the way to go. That there are certainly cases where people, will make bad decisions. So I would not choose to ride a motorcycle, period. Never mind ride a motorcycle without a helmet. But if someone came to me and said, look, the thrill I get of riding a motorcycle and having the wind go through my hair, it's just one of the greatest feelings that I can experience in life. And I am willing to take the chance that I know the risks that I'm going to take. And I'm willing to take the chance that something bad may happen to me because I like experiencing that thrill. Once they reason through something like that, to take the line from one of my leftist colleagues, who am I to judge? Who am I to judge that that way of living your life is worse than the way I choose to live, which is to not get on the motorcycle at all? Now, I think the answer then is, well, are there non-contingent harms being experienced by a third party? So, for instance, if someone chooses to drive around without their motorcycle on, drive around without their helmet on, should you have to bear the medical costs if the person falls off and suffers severe injuries? That's an externality. That is a non-contingent harm externality. And I would say in that case that you should be protected from that. So I think that got to your question. I mean, I think that's the sure, people make decisions we disagree with. But that's, we live in a free society.
So the main aspect of policy implication that you discussed was welfare programs. So what do you have to say about, I guess an argument to be made is that the state needs to intercede in the economy when the failure of a firm is going to lead to a non-optimal result, right? So bailing them out, even though it is an externality, their decisions, their benefits created a cost for all of society.
Sure.
Supposing that the failure of that firm would cause, such a severe problem in the economy that these people insist they ought to be bailed out. What do you have to say about that?
I would say no.
No.
I mean, that it's easy to come in and say, so if we're talking about the financial bailout of not too long ago, where the state bails out banks, they bail out the auto industry, they bail out home mortgage places. I mean, there were a lot of things that led up to that point where you're in this situation where it's like, ooh, this is really bad, right? What do we do? Well, the only reason we got there was because the state allowed people to take out, they started backing loans that they shouldn't have backed. So we're that way in education right now. So you've got a ton of government-backed loans that we're giving out to college students that we should probably not do. So it's not just policy implications for social welfare programs, but these are policy implications for, say, something like education. So what would be the solution how would we deal with education? I would say it would be the same thing. So you look at the city of New Orleans. Orleans Parish, you're familiar with the Orleans Parish Public Schools. Kevin, you might be familiar with the Orleans Parish Public Schools too, and Deanne, you might be as well. So in Orleans Parish, we spend $17,500 per pupil. Oh yeah. If you back out buses and lunches, right? Since that's not actually part of education, but it's getting people there in the food, right? We spend over $12,500 per pupil in Orleans Parish. $12,500 is more than any other school in Orleans Parish with the exception of two, Isidore Newman School and another private school. So what would the solution be there? If it was the will of the people to say, look, we think that everyone deserves quality education, then what's the role of the state at that point? And I would argue for something like vouchers. Get the state out of education, right? Kevin actually said something really useful earlier, and I'm going to give him credit for this comment, is that what you want is when you have the state acting like a referee, right? You want the state to be neutral. You want the state to be able to serve as the arbiter of competing claims. When you have citizens that have competing claims, that the state can come in and act as a neutral party. But what we have right now is the state's getting involved not as even a non-neutral party. They're one of the entities, right? So you have state education, you have whatever else. And again, my point isn't to privatize everything, but rather to figure out what we're after. And if what we're after is, say, more efficient healthcare or more efficient education, by that I mean less expensive and doing at minimally the same as what we're doing now. If we're after more efficient education or more efficient social welfare programs, and we believe that for the most part, generally speaking, individuals are better off when they're able to make decisions for themselves, then things like a voucher program, school choice, or whatever else would work in education, cutting people checks for social welfare programs and not doing things like monitoring what they eat, right? Or seeing if you're receiving welfare, right? To have someone come in and making sure there isn't a man hiding in the closet or under the bed or something. I mean, this is how we're operating right now. So I think that's where I would go in terms of most of this intervention. I think it's a tough call, though, when you say, okay, the entire financial system is about to collapse and you have all of these people who've been investing in the stock market and their retirement's there, and if the bank fails, then they get nothing. Part of me says, let them get nothing. The other part of me says they really didn't know what they were doing. So it's a tough situation. I'll grant that. I've got no easy. I don't think anyone has a good answer for that. But what you probably don't do is save the jobs and give people bonuses at the bank. You probably make sure that the people who were affected as third parties who didn't know that they were getting involved, you probably make sure that they're whole. But beyond that, I think you just let it go.
Follow up on that
Yeah.
about too big to fail, right? So it's so I wonder what you're using the analogy of we want the state as a referee, not as a team playing the game or a player playing the game.
Yeah.
What about the question of too big to fail? So there, the hypothetical is you get a bank or some other firm that becomes so large that if that bank or firm fails, then they will take the whole country's economy with them.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what's the role should the state antecedent to that say, well, then we can't allow firms to get too big to fail, or should they be prepared to, I guess there are three options, right? You make a rule that they can't get too big, you come in and bail them out when they fail, when they're too big, or you let the whole thing fall down. Which of the three, which is the Surprenant option?
So that's an empirical question. I think I would argue that if a lot of these organizations never had the parachute that was put on by the state, right? I know that if we get too big and fail, we're going to get bailed out, or other government programs that help them get that big. I don't think you ever get a corporation that ends up that big, just by how companies work. I don't think any company would ever be too big. I mean, we've seen failures of lots of industries. We've seen failures of lots of large companies. I still wonder what would have happened had the state just said, you know what, guys, sort it out. You know, you've got insurance on individual investment accounts up to a certain amount. You sort it out. And it sounds somewhat heartless, right? So you've got the 70-year-old woman who I don't know who's losing her retirement because she put all of her money in, say, Citibank, It's a tough question. I don't know. I don't think you get there though. So that's sort of the cop out, right? That's the easy way out. And so the question then you want to ask is, well, okay, so then we're there. What do you do? And I'll go back to my answer before, which is I think the third parties that didn't know what they were getting involved in, I think you try to make them whole as much as possible, and you find some way to penalize the people who put them in that position. And I think what you had was the opposite of that the people weren't made whole and the people who put them in that position didn't get penalized. But that's, again, picking winners and losers, right? So Lehman goes down, but Goldman Sachs is able to pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar because Goldman has friends and Lehman doesn't. Like, that's not the role of the state. That's not the role of the referee. And you could dispute that. You could say, well, look, Chris, you're wrong. That's not how the state should function, right? And I would say, okay, so do we really believe that in a free country or a free situation that an entity with unlimited power should be picking winners and losers in industry? And I would say no.
Other questions? Yeah.
I guess it's more of a comment following on your last statement. It seems that there's a distinction between, following a sports analogy, between a referee and a judge. And sometimes we mix those two together, thinking that the judges are the ones who enforce the rules, when often, even in sports, right, they separate these two out, right? And maybe talking about that distinction can make it easier to kind of siphon those two off.
Yeah, that's a good point. So wait, let him have the mic again. So what do you see? What do you see the difference being? I mean, there's obvious differences between the judge and say the police officers, right? How do you think that gets applied to sports? Because in many ways, the referee is both is identifying the perpetrator and enforcing the rule, right? Issuing the penalty.
Yeah.
That's together.
Yeah. Think about, I think, boxing, pick your poison. Boxing, UFC, right? Where you have referees who know all the rules and enforce them and may give point penalties, but the referees don't determine who wins. You have separate judges who do the scoring.
Well, in theory, you wouldn't have any judges determining who wins in the UFC, right? That's been not to make too fine of a point, but that's a problem with, say, boxing or whatever else. Yeah. Go back to football, right? So in football, we don't have the referees determining who wins for the most part, but we do have the referees both identifying but we don't have them identifying the offender and
deciding how many points you got.
That's right.
I think those are the two functions that can make it kind of that talks about the messiness you're identifying, right? There's one thing to say, hey, here's a penalty, 10 yards.
Yeah.
It's another to say, you've done this action, and this action is worth so many points that determines whether or not you win or not.
So how do you see that connecting with what's going on with society, so outside of the game?
Sure. I think one way, when you're talking about the state being a referee, right, what you're talking about is a state having little or no bias or interest in who wins or how, or even the manner of which determining how you won. Whereas someone who's a judge, they're the ones who decides the metrics of winning and the ultimate result. So, for example, when in the financial case, right, it was, you could say the state was acting as a judge when they were saying, hey, we're going to let Lehman Brothers fail, but Goldman Sachs do well. Or even, let's say, a political one, Bush v. Gore, right? Sure. The argument that's saying that the Supreme Court they weren't being referees and saying, hey, let's decide how these ballots should be counted, but rather, some argue, right, they were deciding that got mixed into who would win the election. So I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, right, which is referee. I mean, when you talk about referees, I'm reading that as people who are enforcing rules, but there's like a Chinese wall, so to speak, kind of as we say in finance, between them and the scoring and the determining of winning.
That's right.
Versus a judge who determines if you won.
But there's always a judgment being made by the referees to determine whether or not something counts as a foul.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Which can influence.
It can, but so you're right. So they're not picking. So if I decide whether or not some action in the box in soccer is a foul. I could be deciding who wins and loses, but it's a judgment call that the referee is making whether or not that's happened. And I think you raise a good point, because one of the problems that we see right now, when you look at how a lot of these court cases are decided, or a lot of the actions on the state, right? They're saying, well, we're just interpreting these rules.
Yeah.
Right? So you look at Bush and Gore, well, we're just interpreting what's here. Right? So they're trying to keep that referee language, I think, involved. But I think you raise an interesting point. And I think the question then becomes, well, do we think the state should function in a way that's beyond, right? Do you think that I'm essentially wrong? Do you think that the state should have a greater function? And by the state, I mean the sort of administrative entities, right, that make up the state apparatus. Should that be doing more than just acting like a referee? Because the story I'm telling is, well, look, I'm interested in maximizing individual freedom, but we also live in a diverse country where you have lots of people with different views in terms of how's the best way to live life. So once you get sort of some focus, right, then the state can do the administering that allow people to pursue that. But do we think that the state should be doing more? Do we think that that state apparatus should be taking a more proactive role? Because I could imagine a situation where the state's acting as a referee in the game, the laws are set up in such a way that we have slavery, right? Let's ignore the founding principle of equality, right? And so what is the right thing to do if you're a referee and you have an escaped slave? Well, if you're following the rules, back he goes, or back she goes. Now, I think you can get around that particular example, but I think there are other examples like that where a lot of people would say, well, look, the referee should be doing something else. And here's the sports situation that bothers me. I like sports. Do you remember the World Cup? It must have been 90, got to do my math. It was 98, 96. It was Ghana and who's Suarez on? Argentina. So Ghana and Argentina are in the semifinals of the finals, right? And Ghana's about ready to score a goal. It's like 1 minute remaining in stoppage time. The game is tied. And any of you remember this? No, this was the first time I started watching soccer, and I was so angry because I was cheering for Ghana. Like, here's this small African country. They have made it to, they're 2 games away from the championship game. And the guy's going to kick the ball, and the goalie is just like way over there. And Suarez, the same guy who bites people, right? Suarez just sort of catches the ball and sort of throws it out, right? So obvious red card, right? Obvious red card, but no goal. No goal. They get a penalty kick. And the only reason I'm telling this story is because you can imagine what happens in the penalty kick. Kicks it over the bar, right? And then Argentina ends up winning, I think, on penalties after the extra time. So here's a situation where you have the rules of the game that have been set up. The referee was acting in accordance with the rules because that's a red card, right? No goal, but red card, person's disqualified, penalty kick. That's what the rules allow. And you look at this and say, this result is obviously unjust. As someone who appreciates sports, this is an obviously unjust result. Ghana should win the game. Are there issues like that or situations like that where we can look at the state and say, because part of me wants to say, look, the referee should have had some way of awarding a point, a goal to Ghana, game over. But do we really want the referees doing that? Like, there are clear rules, the rules were followed, it just didn't work out. And I think that's the kind of tension that I'm worried about. Because I think people get very caught up in a lot of issues, a lot of social issues, that they think that the way the country is set up or the way the laws are set up are fundamentally unjust. You saw this with the marriage equality issue. You've seen this in a lot of other issues. That how this is set up is fundamentally unjust, and so what the state should do is come in and right wrongs. right? The state should act like I wanted the referees to be able to act, which is not to give them a penalty kick, but to, give them a goal. Or to, when the penalty kick was missed, make up something and allow them to have another penalty kick until they finally made the penalty kick and then say, well, the game's over, right? You want that. The problem with that is that once you start picking and choosing, right, you don't respect the rule of law, you don't respect the rules of the game, and you start picking and choosing based on what you think the just result is. That strikes me as a really dangerous place to be for a country. And even though in this particular case of Ghana and Argentina in the game, right, that might have been an unjust result. It's probably better for the game, just like I think it's better for the state when the rules are followed. And when these, as you say, when these people sort of maintain their positions appropriately, right? We don't want the referees saying, well, you know what, that's actually a goal, game over. But maybe folks disagree. Anything else?
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Surprenant.
Well, thank you guys.
was
Appreciate it.